Joining me today is Bill Ferriter. Bill is an author and a speaker, and also a full-time eighth grade science teacher in the Raleigh, North Carolina area. He is, by all accounts, considered an expert in both ed tech and PLCs. He has authored several books and book chapters. His latest book is the Big Book of Tools for Collaborative Teams in a PLC at Work, which is literally a big book of tools. And I know there's a lot of buzz about that book, and people just really excited about all the tools that Bill has put in that book. Now, if you've at all been paying attention, you know that Bill has been and still is very active on social media, especially over the last 8 months as teachers have been pivoting towards remote learning, hybrid learning, and all of the different iterations we've seen throughout the spring and now into the fall. So that's why Bill is here, and that's why I've asked Bill to join me today. We're going to get into all of that in terms of what it's like as a full-time classroom teacher to live this experience with teaching during COVID. So Bill, with all of that, I want to welcome you to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Tom. I sure appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here because, you know, as we've seen the evolution of remote learning, hybrid learning, all the different models around North America and around the world, literally. I'm just excited to hear from somebody who really is, you know, on the front lines, as we like to say, or in the trenches, doing this work with students. So I'm excited to hear your perspective on how things have gone. So I want to start by going back to last spring. You know, COVID-19 starts accelerating last spring, like teachers all across North America and around the world, for that matter. They were pivoting rather quickly to a remote learning model. I'm just curious, can you take us inside your thinking, you know, 7-8 months ago, as things started to happen, you know, quite quickly and somewhat unexpectedly for teachers? Walk us through your thought process as this pivoting was happening, as you were trying to figure out what this remote learning or distance learning was going to look like. Help us sort of take us inside what you were thinking, you know, 7-8 months ago as this kind of unfolded in real time.
Yeah, it was an incredibly interesting pivot, that's for sure. I was actually teaching diseases in my eighth grade curriculum. We study diseases, so we had been talking about vaccines and pandemics, and you know, it was a perfect teachable moment given what was happening. And my students started to ask me whether or not they thought we'd be out of school. And I was like, nah, I don't think that'll happen. We'll be okay. The virus right now is limited to China. It doesn't look like it's going to spread globally. So, you know, we should be fine. And I told them that on a Thursday. I had a doctor's appointment on a Friday, and we were out of school permanently the following Monday. Never saw them again, like
Wow.
at least in person. And I was heartbroken because that group of kids was something special. You know, I had taught them when they were in sixth grade. I had just gotten moved to eighth grade. So they had helped me through a year of transition too. They were a group that meant a lot to me because I was taking a risk in eighth grade, having never taught the curriculum before, but I knew that I could take risks with that particular group because they had a relationship with me to begin with. And the first thing I thought when we switched to remote and hybrid learning actually had nothing to do with learning. You know, what I was most concerned about was, were the kids safe and were they fed, and you know, were they in a situation where they felt like they could be comfortable and successful as people at home? You know, what were mom and dad up to? What new responsibilities did they take on at home because mom and dad were still trying to work and they had to pick up the slack for their families? So a lot of my initial concerns, which I think probably were true for a lot of teachers, had nothing to do with teaching and learning, but instead had everything to do with, how do I support these kids as, you know, people who are living in their communities, who are going through what is obviously a traumatic time for them too. So once we had that all nailed down, which involved lots and lots of phone calls, which involved trips to neighborhoods that aren't really all that close to our particular building, which involved knocking on a bunch of doors. Once all that was done, then I could like shift my focus to teaching and learning. And what was cool to me, I think what I liked the most, is that in this spring, our district made a lot of choices that other districts did too, in the sense that learning wasn't required for students. They didn't have to come to any live lessons whatsoever. Also, grades weren't given. We weren't allowed to score anything. Standardized tests were ditched. You know, in our district, we didn't have any standardized testing, and kids and parents both knew that. And so what that became was, all of the things that I don't like about school were gone, right? Like grade grubbing, when kids are
Yeah.
like constantly looking for individual points, it didn't matter anymore because we weren't grading anything and the kids knew it. Standardized tests, trying to grind through EOG review, that didn't have to happen at the end of last year. And I thought that was really kind of neat. Like it created new opportunities to focus just on learning and learning for learning's sake, as opposed to learning because I'm chasing a grade or learning because there's an EOG test on the way. To me, the greatest challenge was, how do I encourage the kids to come to me? Because our lessons weren't even required. Like a student didn't have to log in ever. They didn't have to complete any assignments whatsoever. In fact, teachers weren't even required to offer live lessons to students if they didn't want to. We were encouraged to post assignments online that kids could complete, but we didn't have to offer a lesson to students in Google Meet or in Zoom. There didn't need to be a live component of our work whatsoever. But I wanted to, because I knew that the kids needed to fill that void of school. Like a lot of students need school for stability's sake, right? Or
Yeah.
for routine's sake. And to have that all taken away, where maybe mom and dad are losing their job, maybe somebody in your family has ended up with COVID, maybe you're just worried about what this pandemic means. Oh yeah, and school is gone too. That was really difficult for kids. So pretty quickly, I decided I was going to offer live lessons because I felt like it was a place for lots of kids to come and feel like there was some stability and normalcy in their life. And then pretty quickly, I realized that if the kids were going to come to my live lessons, I needed to make sure that I connected everything that we were doing to something that was more meaningful and more important and more purposeful to our kids. And so that was cool, right? Like it was an additional challenge for me as a teacher to find ways to hook kids into coming. I think that sometimes over the course of our careers, teachers get lazy because kids are going to come to our rooms whether we're good instructors or not. And I needed to realize that I didn't have that hook anymore. Compliance wasn't the reason that kids were going to come to my room. There was no compliance whatsoever. And I really like that. It was neat for me to be able to tinker with my instruction and the curriculum that I chose to deliver, all with the goal of luring students in as the primary driver. And I liked it. I really enjoyed it. To be perfectly honest, it was neat. And it was cool to see my kids respond to it. It was not uncommon. I think I taught last year, I had 120 students who were assigned to me. And I would do 2 live lessons a week. I offered them both in the morning and in the afternoon because I wanted to be flexible for kids. And I think over the course of most of my lessons, I would have a good 80 to 90 kids come, which I felt really good about, to see almost my whole caseload in a completely optional environment. I thought was neat. It felt like a service that I was offering to kids, and they really responded to it.
That's been such a common theme of folks I've spoken with about, how they've navigated the pandemic, the importance of relationships and connecting with kids. The first thing you mentioned, the second thing you mentioned, that again, prioritizing about what truly matters and what we can do without. But the third piece I really appreciated was this idea of, and yes, we have students who struggle to make a regularly scheduled live lesson, but how much kids thrive on predictability and grounding with being able to connect with you on a regular basis. It would seem to me that would give them, in all of the sort of perceived or real chaos that they were dealing with in their lives, that the ability to have the option to come and join a live lesson to just kind of get grounded with their teacher would seem to be very comforting to so many of them. In your specific role, what back then, what was one of the biggest challenges, or maybe there's several of them, but when you think about the biggest challenge you faced early on, and how did you overcome that? Like, what were some of the things that you had to overcome early on as you transitioned into this remote learning model?
As much as I hate to talk about technology, I enjoy technology, but I put myself as a teacher first and a tech guy second.
Yeah.
I think good teaching always trumps good technology. But if I were to say what was the biggest challenge was figuring out all the ins and outs of the rules of technology and access to technology, both within my district and then for my students. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. I wanted to use Zoom. I mean, originally I jumped on Zoom. I got myself a free account. I think I even paid for an upgrade because I could get access to more students and permission levels, things like that. And I had it all figured out. I ran a couple of live meets with my kids, and then my district decided that we couldn't use Zoom. And the reason was justified, right? This back in the spring, remember Zoom bombing was
Zoom
a thing.
Bombing, yeah.
It wasn't even a small thing. It was a big thing.
Yes, it was a big thing.
And so, my district had to catch up with their decisions around what they were and were not going to allow technology-wise. And I wanted to act faster than that, simply because I wanted to fill that chaos that you spoke about. You mentioned whether it was real or whether it was not. To the kids, it felt very real, right? And so I wanted to move fast, and I would get ahead of my district, and then I would have to take 3 steps back and then reimagine whatever it was that I had just figured out using whatever tool ended up being approved by the district. So that was a challenge. It was also a challenge because I knew that there were kids who didn't have access to technology. And that was not something that I could solve personally, right? And that drove me bananas. Like my school serves, we have the majority of the kids who live right around my building are middle-class kids with, access to technology at home. However, we've got about 20% of our population, one node is what we call it here, who live in some pretty tough circumstances and who don't have access to high-speed internet at home and who probably don't have their own devices. They were regularly borrowing devices here at school. And I knew that those kids couldn't access my lessons. And I knew that there wasn't a lot I could do about that. I knew my district was working on it. Like most districts in probably all over the world, I think our district responded incredibly at providing our students with food and access to technology that they've never had before. And those plans were accelerated and hard to implement. So I'm really proud of what we did. But it meant that there were a lot of kids missing out, and I wasn't sure what I could do about that, So there's some moral tension inside of me around, should I keep offering these lessons knowing that some of my students can't access them? Or should I work harder on trying to help every kid access my lessons?
Right.
And what's the right answer to that question? I'm not sure that I ever found the right moral answer to that question, at least in the spring.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma, because I think pre-COVID, we may at times have all been guilty of forgetting how much schools provide to students just beyond learning, in terms of food, in terms of predictability around adult access and support from adults in their lives, technology, all of those things, suddenly, became exposed, and realizing that not all students have access, not all students, have predictability around, there's food insecurity, there may not be the kind of support at home. And so it really forced a lot of tough conversations. But it sounds like your district acted as, these things still take time, right? Even if you recognize a deficit, it's still going to take time to put bandwidth into motion and put tools in students' hands. Can you maybe just give us a little bit of insight, like what exactly did your district do to address that equity issue?
I was super proud of my district, and I think, and I hope that most communities around the world are proud of their school districts too, because we really did have to plug a lot of holes and fill a lot of gaps. And the things that schools provide became really obvious once schools weren't there to provide them anymore. My school started by providing meals, free lunches for students. And that involved determining where in the communities were the right spots to start distributing those meals, right? So where's the right community center to go to so that we can reach the most kids? Who's going to distribute the meals, and how are they going to be prepared and delivered? And that was up and running, I want to say within a week. And it blew my mind that we could figure out how to feed kids, which was really one of my major concerns about our student population that struggles, is where are their meals going to come from? The fact that we could address that in no time was awesome. And our district went beyond just feeding our students. It became, hey, anyone who's hungry, come and get a lunch right now. We
Right.
don't care who
Right.
you are. If you're not enrolled in our school, still come and get a lunch. If
Yeah.
you're an older brother who's graduated, still come and get a lunch. And
Yeah.
that made me really proud.
Yeah.
The next step that our district took was we had rolled out a few years ago a computer initiative where every single classroom in our district had 10 devices of some kind, whether they were Chromebooks, whether they were laptops, whether they were iPads. Well, they came pretty quickly, like within 2 weeks or so, and took every one of those devices back out of the building
Mm.
and started distributing them to students. So students
Right.
could request a device and the district would bring those devices. We had always had in the distance, our district, we're a school district of 190,000 kids. So it's a pretty big district. And
Yeah.
they had always kind of thought that they might go one-to-one someday. And those plans got accelerated super quickly so that we could get more devices on hand as soon as possible so that every
Yeah.
kid who needed one could have one. And then the last thing that they did was they did two other things that I was impressed by. The first is they found support for Wi-Fi hotspots for any family that needed them. They then extended that so that they could provide Wi-Fi hotspots for every student. So it went from one hotspot per family to one hotspot per student. Because what we found was that kids could get online, but if there were 3 or 4 students in the family all trying to get online, that hotspot wasn't handling the bandwidth demands to participate in a live lesson or
Right.
those sorts of things. So I thought that was
Yeah.
a really neat step. And then the very last thing that they've done that I think is neat is they've recruited community sponsors to start providing childcare and after school support for both teachers' children who need it, but also for families who need it as well.
Yeah.
So there's a big focus on, well, if mom and dad are going back to work and you've got students who live in a community where maybe they don't get as much support as they can, or maybe it's not completely safe to stay home alone, then we started to find ways to provide those students with childcare.
Yeah.
So all those steps are neat, right? Like
Right.
it wasn't just addressing the academic needs of kids. It was addressing access to all kinds of basic needs that many of us take for granted. And
Yeah.
that was
It
cool.
just shows you how, integral schools are as, just a foundation in our communities. Do you think a lot of those, approaches, programs, initiatives, et cetera, will they have a lasting legacy? Do you think they're acute solutions, or do you see, whether it's the bandwidth issue, whether it's childcare, do you see those as being maybe not permanent, but in some cases permanent, sort of historical, like having historical legacy in terms of as we come out of the pandemic? Do you see those maintaining themselves going forward?
It's such an interesting question. And I'm like choked up a little bit because I don't know that providing individual students with hotspots addresses like bandwidth equity issues in our highest needs communities.
Right.
I don't know that providing students with or communities with access to childcare as needed, I don't know that that's something that's going to stick around long after we're done. It doesn't
Right.
put a childcare center in a high needs community.
Mhm.
So I would like to think that they would be historical and that they would be permanent.
Yeah.
I just have questions about that, because we haven't really changed anything structurally
Mhm.
about our highest needs communities. We've addressed needs that they have in the immediate present, but those solutions that we've generated are solutions that don't feel super permanent to me.
Mhm.
I think the awareness of need and the knowledge that schools address lots of needs is something that will be permanent.
Yeah.
But I'm not so sure that the solutions that we've put in place are structural changes to communities. And that worries me, right? Because,
Yeah.
as soon as the pandemic goes away and people aren't thinking about it anymore,
Mhm.
districts begin to say, hey, wait a minute, why are we still paying for all these wireless hotspots? you know, and when you combine the fact that, you know, income that supports education comes from community tax dollars, which are down like crazy, it makes me wonder about whether or not a district will start to question their investment in things that we really ought to invest in the long term. So I would hope they'd be historical, but I'm not sure they will be.
Yeah, the one thing I think that districts are going to have a tough time running away from, districts, municipalities, cities, states, is that we have not just been dealing with a pandemic in 2020. We've also been dealing with, you know, racial equity, the disparity between, you know, socioeconomic status, and while the pandemic will likely be resolved, you know, in one way, shape, or form going forward, that still leaves questions about equity, especially for Black and Brown and Indigenous learners who really have been disadvantaged by a system for so long that those issues are not going to go away with, you know, a vaccine or you know, as we see the pandemic. So hopefully those questions can be answered more permanently in communities that include the schools. It's not just up to the schools to solve those issues for sure, but schools have to be a part of that solution because they understand the needs of students so well and families, and are so connected to those families.
Yeah, that's truth.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Hopefully, we could that legacy. We just can't run away from that. I'm wondering about the flip side. Was there anything about the move to remote learning that was maybe surprisingly easier? I'm not saying it was easy, but were there some things that were surprisingly easier than you had anticipated, especially in the spring? But even now, are there things that you're finding, wow, I thought that was going to be a big deal, but it really isn't?
Yeah, I saw that question you had when you sent me the questions earlier, and there are a lot of things that I like better about instruction now than instruction before. I'll give you a few examples. First of all, I feel like I get way more participation out of my students now than I did when they were in my classroom. And that's largely because there's technology affords multiple avenues to participate without the social stigma that goes into taking a risk in a middle school classroom, right? There are lots of middle schoolers who will never raise their hand in a classroom because they're afraid of whatever comes out of their mouth becoming something that is judged by all of their peers. Whereas when you work in a digital space with students, you can give them lots of anonymous ways in order to be able to share their thinking. And the result is, I think I get way more participation now than I ever did before. From far more students than ever before. And so I feel really good about that. I think that's fun. I feel like I have some students, I'm in a unique situation because this group of kids that I'm now teaching are the last group of kids that I taught when I was a sixth grade teacher. So this group in particular that I've worked with this year are students that I know. And when they were with me in sixth grade, and even last year, I would hear about them in seventh grade. There are several kids who really, really struggled with the social side of school. They couldn't really cooperate while they were, you know, next to another student. It was difficult for them to respond appropriately when disciplined by a teacher. There were those sorts of kind of interpersonal challenges for this bunch, and I haven't seen any of it. Some of the students who struggled the most when they were with me in sixth grade are just soaring right now, really succeeding. And so I think that's a positive. Like, I think that there are some students who remote learning has been a victory for. Now, I don't think that's the case for all students. You know, I have an 8-year-old, I said that wrong. I have a, what is she now? 11-year-old daughter. She's in sixth grade.
You're supposed to know, Bill. You're supposed to know.
Supposed to know. She's in sixth grade, and she's incredibly lonely. You know, here in our district, students rotate in for, they're in 3 cohorts. So they rotate in for 4 days every 3 weeks. And my daughter went to her first day of middle school, official face-to-face middle school yesterday. And it was so good to see her when she came home. She was like, Dad, I made 2 friends and I know my teachers now. And Miss G, my math teacher, she really likes me. And it's been so sad because she comes to school with me, you know, when she's not in the building. And I've just watched her be, I think, dejected and lonely, like she doesn't, every morning I'm like, honey, don't you want to take a shower before we go to school? Nope. So like 3-4 days a week, like I can't even get her to shower. And she's sitting in a chair, slouched down, wrapped up in a blanket, like listening to her teachers remotely. And so it hasn't been good for her.
Right.
However, I do think that for some students, this mode of instruction and this opportunity to interact has been a real positive, and that's been a surprise to me. I wouldn't have been able to pick the students who would thrive until this all happened, right? If you'd have asked me 2 years ago whether an all virtual environment would have worked for the students right now who are succeeding as well as they're succeeding, I probably couldn't have picked out that list. The list probably would have been different, but so that brings up an interesting question, right? Like you asked a minute ago whether or not there'd be structural change in communities based on the response to the pandemic. Right. What I most want to know is, will there be structural change in school? Now that we've had the pandemic, our district, like many, offers a virtual academy option for families. Right. So families don't want to come back to school in person, they don't have to. And they can learn completely online for the entire year. And in our building, we've got just over 65% of our students have chosen that all virtual option. And many of them are thriving. And so the question becomes, when the pandemic goes away, does virtual academy go away too?
Right. That's a good question.
And I don't know that it should, like based on what I've seen, I think that there will still be some students who could benefit from an all virtual environment, from the flexibility and freedom that comes from not having to be in the physical building each and every day.
Yeah. So when you look at that group of students who are thriving under those circumstances, are you not seeing a kind of, because we know that middle school especially is such a tumultuous social environment that some kids thrive, some kids don't. Are you seeing a common theme amongst students who may have had, some struggles in the social context of middle school? Is that a common theme amongst the students who are thriving, or are you seeing a variation that is kind of unpredictable in terms of who's thriving with remote?
Well, I think that the students who thrive in school, right? Like you know who I'm talking about, the students who've made A's their entire lives, their moms and dads may well be teachers, their parents certainly have hammered the importance of education into their heads. They're still succeeding, just as we would expect. Right. What I see, the pattern that I see is my students who are thriving that I did not expect to thrive are kids who wrestled with that social part of school. I mean, like could not sit next to other people. Like if you put them into a group, there's a bickering match that breaks out in 14 seconds flat. Like students who have never really maybe felt good about themselves, so they struggled a bit with self-esteem. And so that would come across as insecurity in the classroom. And in middle school, and particularly in 8th grade, insecurity doesn't get you too terribly far. No. Like, I feel like you said something important there, right? Like I think most of us would look back to middle school and say it was either terrific or it was horrible. There's no in between in middle school, right? It can be a social nightmare for students. And I think the virtual academy part has created less of that social intimidation that goes along with a middle school environment. So that's been interesting. I do worry, like with my own child, I worry about, if I were to keep her virtual academy, does that mean she loses some of the opportunity to develop the social skills that she'll need in order to be successful in the future? Right. But then the flip side of that exact same coin becomes, like, are we convinced that those social skills can't be developed online? I mean, I'm pretty certain that I see more interaction between my students in the chat box than I would have ever seen between my students in the regular classroom. Right. And do we value that kind of social interaction between kids? When a student offers another student a hand or some advice or some guidance in the chat, do we downplay that and say, hey, well, that's not social interaction? Right. Whereas if the exact same kid offered that same hand in class, we'd make them the student of the month for showing kindness, right? Like, so it becomes an interesting question. Do kids, are social skills developed in digital spaces too?
Yeah, I
Um,
think there's a couple of things to unpack there. One, the idea that sure, in the school context, socialization is an important part, not just the learning, but the socialization. But the loss of that in a virtual academy then assumes that school is the only place that a student socializes, right?
right.
These kids play on sports teams, these kids go to dance, they have a number of activities that they participate in outside of the school environment. So the assumption being that school's the only, well, that's socializing within the learning context. And certainly there's no other place in society where that many students gather on that a regular basis. But the assumption that that's the only place they socialize, and you're right. I think you're absolutely spot on. I think your question, the answer to it is yes. I think you can develop those. Socialization is different now, and I think we have to, in some
Right.
respects, embrace the modernization of what this interconnected world is all about. I mean, here you are in North Carolina, I'm in on the west coast of Canada, and we're communicating and having a dialogue as if we were face to face. And
Right.
to me, I think your question is a good one, and I think the answer to that is yes. I think we can, and I'm guessing that you think the same way, that those
A
social
hundred,
skills can be developed.
100%. And
Yeah.
it's just a matter of convincing other people.
Right.
Hey,
Right.
hey, Tom, here's the other question that I don't have direct evidence of.
Hmm.
However, I think that some of my colleagues have given me anecdotal evidence of. I've got a colleague who works in a school that is 93% free and reduced lunch. It is the most difficult school. I guess I'm going to put air quotes on that. It's the most difficult school in our
Hmm.
community. Lowest test scores, students with the highest needs, those sorts of things. And one of the things that she has noticed is that her kids are thriving in a virtual setting.
Hmm.
And so that brings up another interesting question, right? Like our schools, as we have them currently and traditionally structured, um, are they places where marginalized student populations have traditionally been successful? Like places where students who have, like, our suspension rates are higher with our kids of color, the academic achievement of kids of color and kids who live in poverty are
Hmm.
always lower than kids who don't, or kids who come from more um, whiter and richer communities.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I wonder is maybe this virtual environment is a is helping us to break away from those traditional structures of schools
Hmm.
that have always rewarded the haves and punished the have-nots.
Right. Right.
So,
That's
and
a
I don't have any tangible evidence of it in my own room
no.
because I don't have enough students to draw a conclusion from. But my friend who works in the highest poverty school, like, she's seeing a lot of kids thrive in ways that they wouldn't have if they were in the traditional building.
Yeah.
And I think that's worth wrestling with. I think communities need to wrestle with, are our schools places where all students of all colors from all backgrounds,
Hmm.
regardless of the success or struggles of their family, are our
Hmm.
schools places where everyone succeeds? And right now the answer is obviously no.
Yeah.
And then do we see higher levels of success in a virtual environment for those students? And if so, why?
Yeah.
Like, I think
Yeah.
that's something that's worth wrestling with.
It's a really good question. It makes me think about, in an earlier episode, I had Anthony Muhammad on, and we talked a lot about equity, and both in school and in society. I also had Nicole on, Nicole Dimich, as you know
Sure.
Nicole, and her Thrive Ed students in Minneapolis. Again, talking about, and one of the common themes, both from my conversation with Anthony, but also the students at Thrive Ed at Nicole's nonprofit. One of the common themes was reimagining school.
Right.
I'm hypothesizing here and wondering if, what the pandemic has forced us to do is reimagine school, reimagine access, reimagine, what does success look like, what does it mean to be successful. And as we
Sure.
start to reimagine that, we broaden our definition of what success is. In some respects, we start to broaden our definition of success in ways that takes us outside uh, of the kind of white Eurocentric definition of success that has always been the anchor of our schools, and we've
Right.
expanded that, almost been forced to expand that. And again, I'm hypothesizing here, like you, wondering why that's happening. It's wonderful that that is happening and that you're
Sure.
seeing that, and learning lessons from that would be, taking a deeper dive into that, maybe almost
I
like
hope someone does that, right? Like,
a
I hope there's some
debrief or something.
research on it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Because even like an exit interview, that once the pandemic is over, hour to kind of debrief with those students and say, why, what was it about this circumstance would be very interesting information for sure. So let's pivot here to, I think you have you've been, like I said, you've been very outspoken on social media, and you've been very forthcoming with, here's what I think is the right approach. So you've been doing that. You've always been very active on social media, but certainly during the pandemic, you've been very, vocal. And I don't mean that in a negative connotation. You've just been very vocal about the perspective
Opinionated.
of, well, and you're entitled to that opinion because you're doing the work and you're having successes. So let's start with, I want to talk about the do's and don'ts. Okay. So we have teachers right now in the midst of any type of iteration, hybrid learning, rotating schedules, cohorts, full remote learning. We got the gambit out there. So from your perspective, if a teacher were to kind of audit themselves right now, if they were to, we have all these different models. If they were to audit themselves and say, okay, am I doing it the quote unquote right way? The world according to Bill, what are some things that teachers, what are the do's? What are some things that teachers should look for from your perspective to say, yeah, I think I've got the right perspective and the right approach to this hybrid, this remote learning situation that I'm in right now? Well, how would I audit myself and know that I'm on the right track?
Well, I would say the first thing to make sure that you're doing, and it's so hard not to slip into a don't right now, Tom.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's really important for teachers to recognize is that we can't teach the way that we've always taught, and we can't teach every bit of content that we've always taught before, and we can't expect kids who are working without the traditional structures and supports of schools to be able to tackle the exact kind of tasks that we've always asked them to tackle before. It's not realistic. It's not possible. I hear, and you referenced my social media stream. One of the things that I keep hearing in social media is teachers saying, we wish people had some grace with us. We wish they understood how hard it was for us right now. We wish that that parents and school leaders would, give us the benefit of the doubt and like work with us and be patient with us as we learn all these new strategies. And every time I see those messages, in my mind, I substitute the word kid in there and teacher, right? Because we need to show that same grace to our students. We need to recognize that they're working and learning in a completely different environment than they've ever worked and learned in before. Right. And so when we don't extend that same sort of grace and understanding to our students, I think it creates really unhealthy environments for kids. Right. I only speak from the standpoint of both a parent and a teacher, and I watch my daughter sometimes being asked to complete lots and lots and lots and lots of work, right? And it breaks my heart because the end of the day will roll around, it'll be 3:00. I'll finally get a chance. She's over in that classroom over there right next to me during the course of the day. And I stick my head in 3, 4, or 5 times, but I'm not with her all day long. Right. And we'll get to the end of the day and there'll still be 7 assignments that she needs to complete. And it's heartbreaking because we'll get home and sit on the couch and spend another 2 hours doing schoolwork, which she doesn't want to do. And that's all from I think that's a function of teachers who are not understanding that the way that we've always done things isn't going to work right now. And it's not fair to ask students to do those things right now. So those are all don'ts, right? Like start to understand that your kids need grace and understanding too. If you want it for yourself, if this has been the hardest work that you've ever done before as a teacher, please remember that it's also the hardest work your students have ever done before as learners too. And parents as well. Like, I struggle to support my own kid in a good year, right? Like, because I work a full-time job and a part-time job. I'm like every other regular Joe out there. And so being able to support her through a pandemic has been a real challenge. So how do you turn those into do's? I think the first thing that I would do is give your kids the benefit of the doubt as learners. Be understanding with them. That might mean rethink your grading policies. Are you being flexible about due dates? Have you started to give fewer, higher quality assignments? Like that's a phrase I keep going back to in my own mind is, Like I don't need 18 assignments in order to assess mastery. I don't even need 18 questions on a test to assess mastery. If I ask one higher order question, that's going to get me the same amount of information, if not better information than ever before. So concentrating on fewer higher quality tasks, I think is going to help teachers because there's less for us to grade, right? Like we've gotten rid of all the chaff. So there's no sense trying to score it and mark it and look at it and provide feedback on it. But I think it's also going to provide some grace and flexibility for students who can't always handle the deluge of information and assignments that come from a building. By the way, that's been my favorite thing about my PLC this year. Lots of people have asked me like, well, do you still meet with your PLC during the pandemic? I mean, where do you find time to meet with your PLC during the pandemic? Or what do you do with your PLC during the pandemic?
Right.
And my answer to that is my PLC has made it our main focus to just cut everything. Like we look at everything that we've done with our students in the past and say to ourselves, this is worth doing again. And if the answer is, then we cut it. It's gone. We don't need it anymore. So prioritizing, using your time with your PLC to prioritize the assignments that get you the most information with the least amount of like work that kids have to generate is, I think, a worthwhile thing to do right now. Looking at every single assessment and saying to yourself, is every question on this assessment worth asking right now? Do we need all of them in order to be able to assess mastery? And the odds are the answer is no. Right. And so cutting down to just the basics provides breathing room for teachers. It provides breathing room for students. And the end result is a collection of work and assignments that is the highest quality stuff that we have. I see this time as an incredible opportunity for PLCs to get hyper focused on the best of what they've always done. Right. And if teachers can focus on that, what they're really doing, if you need a selfish reason to do that, what you're really doing is giving yourself less work to grade, less assignments to provide feedback on, less work to generate and assign, and however you generate and assign that work. So if you need a selfish reason, it's going to create space for you as a teacher too. But what I really see it doing is showing respect to students and understanding that they can't tackle everything that they've always tackled because they're working independently and alone. And then for the PLC, it results in, by the end of this year, my team is going to have a real clear sense of what is the best of everything we've done and what should we never do again because it was a complete waste. If we create time for deeper thinking in class by getting rid of stuff that isn't necessary, I think this year will end up being a victory for our team. Did I answer your question there? Did I give some details?
I think you did. It's all good. I mean, there are these, these slivers of good news and positivity that I think we have to find during this time. And one of them is, you mentioned this, it's an expression I've used for years, which is quality over quantity.
Always.
In terms of your assessments. And then the question of prioritization, teachers, many schools have asked me, what should we do? And I asked them, have you prioritized your standards? And they say, yes, we have. I said, well, do it again. Prioritize your prioritized standards, because again, you're having to rethink, what is possible for us to cover. And I think your point about the grace and the compassion for students is well taken. In fact, you might even argue our students are deserving of more compassion and more understanding as the only non-adults in the equation who don't have the emotional maturity and sort of stability that we have as adults. We really do have to give them the benefit of the doubt and maybe check in with them, which leads me to my next question, because you recently tweeted out this question, and you probably remember, you asked this on Twitter. Has your school or district surveyed students yet to see what they think is working in your pandemic teaching and learning plans? Remember, Hattie has identified, John Hattie being John Hattie has identified feedback from students as one of the highest leverage practices we can use in schools, end quote. That was the tweet you sent out. Sure. So you've done that. I know you talked to your students and you've got their feedback. Can you talk about two things? One is what tangible value have you seen from those conversations from your students? And specifically, what are the students telling you?
Sure. So, when Hattie speaks about feedback, he oftentimes argues that the most valuable feedback isn't feedback from teacher to student, but instead from student to teacher. And
Right.
I've shared that with audiences before. And what they ask me is, well, what does that mean? Like, how would feedback from a student help me, or what should I do with it? And the answer is, you use that to inform your instructional practices.
Right.
We can get a real sense for which parts of our instruction are working for our kids and which ones are not, just by listening to our students, who are in the end are our consumers. I've been fortunate in the sense that I've surveyed kids for years. Like, it's just a regular part of my class. And I'm always interested in whether they think individual instructional practices are working, or what part of my class resonates. And so doing it during the pandemic has been a breeze for me. And it's actually been super important to me, because I'm teaching in a brand new way, right? And I say that to my kids all the time. I'm like, I've never done this before either. Brand new pandemic teacher right here, so I need your feedback about what's working and what's not. So here are some lessons that I've learned. The number one thing that my kids value, and this is, I think it's worth every teacher thinking about and recognizing and realizing. The number one thing that they say is they really appreciate the fact that I notice them in my classes. So just a bit of background for your listeners. Right now, I'm teaching a full virtual academy caseload. I have 160 students across 4 classes. I teach them only remotely. So these are kids who've chosen not to come in the building for the entire first semester. Many of them have signed up for the second semester. I teach 8th graders, so I bet you can guess how frequently they turn on their webcams, right? Like, the answer is about as often as teachers turn their webcams on during faculty meetings, which is essentially not at all, right? So I look at profile pics all day. But that hasn't stopped me from noticing and recognizing the kids all the time in my class. So I turn on my class about 10 minutes before class starts, and I sit and as each kid walks in, I recognize them. Hey, it's good to see you. How you doing today? Ryan, holy cow, I see that your profile pics changed. Tell me what that is. I don't even know what that is. If I know something about them, if I know an interest of theirs, I'll bring it up. Today, I have a student who's a huge New England Patriots fan. Well, they won the football game last night, right? So, hey, Ryan, congratulations. I noticed that your team won last night. Or I'll say things like, hey, you know what? You really make me laugh. That is the funniest thing I've heard in a long time. I'm so glad you're here today. And remember, I'm saying this to profile pics, right? It's to some kids who I legit, it's November. I still don't know what they look like. However, I'm making a real effort to acknowledge that they've come to class, to say goodbye to them when they leave class. I do multiple small engagement opportunities in the chat box. I'll say to my students, hey guys, here's a yes, no question. And I'll ask a question and I'll require them to give me a yes, no in the chat box. And what that does is it throws names up in my chat, and I can say, oh, thanks, Mina. I appreciate that reply. Sandeep, great thinking. I really appreciate that too. Thank you so much for sharing. So the kids hear their names over and over and over again from me throughout the course of my virtual class, and of everything in my surveys, that's what they value the most. One student in the spring of last year said, I feel noticed, and that feels good. And man, it gives me chills, right? Because we all want to be noticed. And remember, I teach middle schoolers. Being noticed in middle school is an even bigger deal. And so what do I attribute some of my success to in the virtual environment? It's an incredibly simple practice. Say hello to your kids. Say goodbye to your kids. Start a conversation with your kids. Thank your students for participating. All of those little things, I think, go a heck of a long way towards creating a space that makes kids feel like they belong. And right now, feeling like they belong is probably more important than anything to getting kids to be successful. If they're teaching, if your school is in a 3-week rotation where you only see groups of kids once every 3 weeks, and then you're teaching them online, well, those 2 weeks while the kids are at home, if you want them to be of benefit, a simple strategy is make sure that your kids know that you care about them and that you notice them and that you see them. So that's probably the most important thing that my kids have said that they care the most about. Now, the other thing that they say is a little bit more technical. I've used a tool, and I know that this is a question that you were thinking about asking a little bit later. I use a tool called Pear Deck, which allows you to turn a presentation or to integrate interactive opportunities into a presentation.
Okay.
And so as I'm delivering a lesson to kids, what Pear Deck allows me to do is really quickly and easily gather information from them. So I can ask a question, and in Pear Deck, every student can reply. And then I can throw up some responses, and I call them spotlight responses, and share them with my students. I can do quick surveys in Pear Deck where kids drag a dot along a rating scale. And all of those kinds of small opportunities to participate are things that my kids have really valued. I use the chat box constantly. I'll say things like, hey guys, scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel about the theory of evolution? Or I'll say, hey guys, scale of 1 to 5, we're talking today about, Charles Darwin and his Galapagos finches. So scale of 1 to 5, how convincing is that to you as evidence? And they respond in the chat box just with a number. Right. All those little opportunities to participate have made my lessons feel more active to kids than I think they're maybe experiencing in other classes. Yeah. Lots of times they feel like a virtual lesson can become sit and get really darn quick. Right. And I think that's especially true if a teacher is trying to teach face-to-face kids and at-home kids at the exact same time. Oh, yeah. Teachers struggle with paying attention to that remote group because you've got a group that's in front of you at that particular moment. And so all of those little opportunities to participate keep my kids from feeling like my lessons are sit and get. Yeah. So those are two really tangible examples of lessons I've learned. Here's one more. I use those chat box ratings constantly. Probably 20 times a class period, my kids are giving me some kind of rating or answer, a quick rating or answer in the chat box. Mm-hmm. And in my last survey, my students said, hey, we'd like to hear our classmates a little more frequently. And so would you ask us to, report out? Can we hear each other's voices more often? Right. So then check this out. Next day, it's, okay, hey guys, listen, I got a question for you. Ryan, would you mind answering? And then there's crickets, right? Like Ryan's like, my mic doesn't work, or I'll say, hey, Sylvia, why don't you grab the mic? And hey, my mic's not working either, Mr. Ferriter. A whole ton of broken mics that next day. Oh, yeah. So I asked the kids, I said, hey, so, you said you wanted the opportunity to hear each other, but now nobody's volunteering. And what they said is, well, we don't want to be put on the spot. Right. So the next strategy was in Pear Deck, I give a little survey that says each time I want someone to grab the mic, I say, are you comfortable grabbing the mic right now? Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm nervous, or no. And so they can tell me, and I can see on the back end of Pear Deck who's said, sure, call on me, Mr. Ferriter, or who has said, nope, don't call on me at all, Mr. Ferriter. So isn't that neat how the feedback from the kids has led to this polishing of my practice? Yeah. And so that's why I think it's worth doing, Yeah, for sure. If we ask, we're gonna find out what's working and what's not. Yeah, so. I think you're so right about how virtual learning can just slip into a passive experience, and everything you talked about really is a way to personalize and socialize a virtual learning environment. To me, is why it's being so successful for you, is because you really have made that effort. For those who aren't familiar with Pear Deck, is it, if you were maybe not as tech savvy as Bill Ferriter, is it I'm not familiar with it. So is it user friendly? Is it fairly intuitive? Can you, and beyond that, are there any other tools that you think folks should know about as good tools for them to explore in this remote environment? Sure. So it's funny because I get that question a lot. I call this the rule of Karen. And I call it the rule of Karen because I'm the guy on my PLT who always comes and says, hey, I've got a new tool. Maybe we should start using with our kids. And Karen, my colleague, says, well, how easy is it to use, Bill? And I'll say, it's incredibly easy. Karen, it's no problem at all. And then Karen goes all kind of psycho and she goes to Sigourney Weaver with her whole easy for who, Bill? Because I think sometimes people who are tech savvy forget that finding a tool that works for you is not really the ultimate goal. What you
Right.
have to do if you're really going to be a contributing member to a collaborative team, the goal is to find a tool that is approachable for all of your colleagues, right? Like if we really do believe that all means all and that we share kids across the hall and the success of students in Karen's room is as important to me as the success of students in my own room, then my goal has to be to find a tool that's approachable to everyone. So you asked specifically about Pear Deck, and I'll give you the answer. I had heard about Pear Deck in maybe March or April. Other teachers were starting to use it. I hadn't tinkered with it ever. I never even looked at it. And then I decided to use it in a presentation that I did over the summer with 1,000 teachers. And so my first experience with it was an audience of 1,000.
Wow.
And I had never used it at all, not even once. And so I was pretty nervous, right? The stakes were certainly high, and it worked without a flaw. I mean,
Wow.
not even one hitch. Pear Deck is essentially, it will, if you use a tool like Google Slides already to make your slides, then what you do with Pear Deck is you can get an add-on, which is something that you add to your Google account. You can get a Pear Deck add-on, and immediately you can take those exact slides and add interactive elements. So if you want to have a draggable rating bar, and that's already something that's built into your slides, you just click the Pear Deck add-on and you can add it. Wow. If you want to create an open-ended question for kids to reply to, you just open up the add-on, click the button that says, I would like kids to answer here. And sure enough, that adds an interactive question. It's incredibly easy to use. The other thing that I really like about Pear Deck, and there are other tools that do similar things, but the thing that I really like about Pear Deck is they have a template library that has, I don't know, I would probably say close to 200 templates right now that cross all areas. So there are sample SEL templates, social and emotional learning templates. There are sample templates for math. There are sample templates for science. There's sample templates for the littles, kindergarten, first, second grade. And so as a teacher, you can immediately go in and look at those sample templates and get an idea of what's possible, and then add those sample templates to your presentation and use them immediately. And I just think that's really, really cool. So it's incredibly approachable, and it's super realistic. And I would encourage everyone to take a look at it. Now, as far as other tools go, I think the key question, Tom, is a question that sometimes we forget when we think about technology. The goal isn't to go find a tool that's really cool. The goal is to go find a tool that supports a practice that you believe in.
Right.
And so in order to recommend tools to people, the first thing that I always need to know is, well, what is a practice that you really believe in? And then let's go find a tool that facilitates that. I'll give you an example. I really think right now, social interaction, or I should say that differently, visual interaction between teacher and student is important right now, especially this year, right? I've got kids I've never met before. I've never seen them before. And so a tool that makes video interaction possible between teacher and students is Flipgrid. So you can throw up a conversation for kids. They're called topics. And maybe it's a question that you want your students to answer. And they can record short video responses to your question, and you can record short video responses back to the student. All of those interactions can be private. In my classroom right now, I set everything as a private topic. So that means the student can hear my response and I can hear the student, but the conversation is not open to the entire class. And I do that because, again, it encourages more participation from my kids. So that visual, feedback, that visual back and forth between teacher and student, I think is important for developing a relationship. So Flipgrid is a tool I pursue. I'll give you another example. Lots of us have performance outcomes in our curriculum. So we need to gather visual evidence of a performance in order to rate student mastery. So we better go out and find a tool that allows us to assess performances. And two that are popular, primary teachers love to use a tool that's called Seesaw, which allows students to record themselves demonstrating mastery and allows the teacher to provide video responses to those demonstrations of mastery. I like to use the tool that's called Padlet to do the exact same work. What's the difference between Padlet and Seesaw? Well, Seesaw is paid. It's not free, and
Yeah.
Padlet's got a pretty robust free version, right?
Right.
So
Right.
why did I pursue Padlet? Not because it's some kind of whiz bang tool I want to share with my kids, but instead because I need a tool where I can gather a performance assessment of my students.
Mhm.
And so that's what I think teachers need to ask when they're thinking about tools is, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? And then what tools will help facilitate that?
Yeah.
Tom, if you're interested, I don't know if you have show notes, but
Yeah, I do.
if you have show notes, as soon as we're done, I'll send you a link. I've got a document where I've written about the practices that I believe in and the
Mhm.
tools that support those practices. So
Yeah.
I'd be happy to share that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would love to put that in the show notes for sure. I think people would be very interested. That Bill, that is such a wise question to ask, which is, what do you want to do, and then find the tool that lets you do that. Versus, people can either be distracted by the shiny object and the tech, and then other people are going to feel overwhelmed by being shown tech tools that don't really align with what they do, and then they think about, well, how is that relevant to me? And I think starting with the idea of what is it that you're hoping to be able to do, and let's go find a tech tool to do that, I think is such a wise way to approach it. So Bill, yeah, go ahead.
And so Tom, let me ask you a quick question then.
Yeah.
Like, who else gets overwhelmed when there's a million tech tools that don't serve a purpose? It isn't just the teachers.
No, it's the students for sure.
It's the kids at home. Our kids are tired of being buried in, quote, new digital tools. And
absolutely,
teachers are working from a place of goodness, right? We assume that kids are motivated by things that we share with them digitally, but that's not the case.
Yeah.
Kids aren't motivated by technology any more than they're motivated by their shoes and socks.
Yeah.
They're motivated by interesting questions. They're motivated by good learning. And so we end up overwhelming our kids with new tools too. So being deliberate about your choices right now, I think, is essential.
It reminds me a lot of, and this isn't really a direct, parallel, but I remember going to a coaching conference back in the early 90s and, listening to a coach talk saying, listen, don't change the drills every week. Pick a handful of drills that develop your athletes, and stick with them and do them well, and go deep with them to develop footwork or to develop vision, or to help students, help athletes understand how to, an angle when they're making a tackle, or setting a screen in basketball. Pick your set of drills and go deep with them, as opposed to changing it, every week. And it reminds me of that in terms of, pick your tools that really align with what you're trying to accomplish in class, and just keep using them, because that repetitiveness creates the familiarity that students crave. And that listen, Bill, I think we could go another hour on all of this stuff, and I've really enjoyed it. And maybe sometime down the road we can as we sort of wrap things up here, we can do this again, because I've learned a lot in terms of how you've approached it. I think you've given some great advice to listeners who are in similar situations to yourself in trying to find their way through. But we're going to finish up with a little bit of fun here, as we always do. I'm going to ask you a few lighthearted questions. I finish up every interview this way, in ways that allow people to get to know you. I think people have gotten to know you professionally very well here, in terms of your focus on relationships, and it's very obvious how much you care deeply for the students you teach. That has come through loud and clear. But let's get to know Bill a little bit on a slightly personal level. Nothing too intrusive, but just some fun questions to finish up here as we go. So I've got a series of questions to ask you. You don't know what I'm going to ask you. They're going to put you on the spot a little bit, and feel free to take the answers in whatever direction you want to go. So let's start with the first one. The first one, I have to admit, is a little bit self-serving. Bill, you've been public about your dual citizenship. You are now a Canadian citizen and a US citizen. And most recently, you were tweeting about now securing your Canadian passport. So I want to ask you, very self-serving question, what is your favorite thing about Canada, or your favorite thing about Canadians?
I would say that my favorite thing about Canada is, and by the way, you wanted this to be lighthearted.
Yeah.
However, to me, the greatest thing about Canada is the focus of your nation on social justice and equity, right? Like, it's in your curriculum. Like, that blows my mind. Like, the fact that like empowering people to think about equity is a part of your instructional program It just, I have chills right now. It leaves
Yeah.
me with chills. Now, if you want something else, like if you
All
want
right, so that's the
little less,
serious answer. Let's go to the fun part.
it's hockey,
Hockey.
100%. I mean,
There you go. Yeah.
God bless Canada, and thank you for your game.
Yeah.
That would be my answer.
Yeah.
So
I've seen a few over the years, a few hockey jerseys worn by you, having lost some friendly wagers about
I lose
hockey
bets
results.
all the time to Canadians, like in fact, here's another one for your show notes, Tom. I
Yeah.
lost a bet on the US versus Canada in the Olympics. I don't know, I want to say 8 years ago. And I had to sing the Canadian national anthem on YouTube. So
Yeah.
I will share that. You can put it in your show notes. You guys got to watch it. It's adorable because at the
Love it.
time my daughter was 4 and she
Mhm.
joined me in singing it. And
Yeah.
she's just cute as can be. So
Awesome. Awesome. Well, now you have dual citizenship, so it's a win-win situation whenever the U.S. and Canada,
100%.
right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Second question. Who for you is the greatest lead singer, not solo artist, the greatest lead singer of a band all time? Who's your all-time favorite
I
lead
mean, it's a
singer?
pretty obvious answer, isn't it? I mean, John Bon Jovi, of course.
Okay. Well, it might be
Did you
obvious to
see
you,
that coming?
Bill.
Did
I
you
did
did you
not.
see that coming, Tom?
I did not. I
We're
did
all living on
not.
a prayer at one point or another, are we not? So,
That's right. Yeah.
I
Well,
can
for me,
sing that too if you'd like.
no. Well,
So
we're running out of time here, Bill. So maybe we'll put something on YouTube for that as well. I did not see that one coming. Yeah. I mean, for me, it begins and ends with Freddie Mercury. But hey,
okay. All
this
right.
is where.
Freddie's up there too.
Okay. All right. But that's all right. All right. So third question. What's the one professional sports team or college sports team that you hope loses every single time they play, no matter who they're playing against? That is the one team that you hope they get throttled each week.
Well, if you ask anyone in Toronto, I think they'd have maybe the same answer. I'm not totally positive. The
Okay.
Boston Bruins. They
Boston
just
Bruins.
they just need to be wiped off the face of the earth.
Well,
I mean,
fun fact, 2011, my beloved Vancouver Canucks were in the Stanley Cup final against the Boston Bruins, lost in Game 7. And so the
nice.
Boston Bruins are up there as a public enemy in Vancouver as well. So I think we're
Good.
we're with you in all of that. Yeah, Toronto, Montreal would say the same thing for sure. Boston is it's one of those franchises in the NHL that's either loved or hated. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Favorite holiday, Christmas or Thanksgiving?
Boy, tough one. I'm gonna go with Christmas because right now it's the one time each year that I get home to Buffalo. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and so it's the one time I get home and see my brother and my sister and my mom,
Okay.
and just hang out with the family.
Nice to connect. Hey, are you a Bills fan then, having grown up in Buffalo?
Who is not a Bills fan? Like, I'm relatively certain that everyone is a Bills fan, right? We're all in the Josh Allen train right now, are we not?
Well, I don't know if all of us are, but something interesting about Canadians is that Canadians always have an NFL team, and certainly Toronto is very much affiliated with Buffalo. As out here in Vancouver, we are very much. There's 5,000, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 Seattle Seahawks season ticket holders that are from Vancouver. So,
well, hey, how'd you like the game a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, didn't like it at all. Not happy about it at all, Bill.
Not happy a little bit.
Question 5, last one before we get to that final question. This is a question that I know is going to be debated in all social circles over the next 6 weeks. It is one of the most important questions that we face every year at this time, and it is this binary choice. And I know it's one of the most intense questions that people debate as they head into the Christmas season. Here's the question. Is Die Hard a Christmas movie?
100%. Not only is Die Hard a Christmas movie, it is the best movie of all time. I mean, I think we can agree on that, right?
Well, I don't know if I could agree with you on that second part. So tell me why it's the greatest. First of all, why is it a Christmas movie? And second, why is it the greatest movie of all time?
Listen, Bruce Willis with bombs. I don't think you can beat that. I feel relatively strongly about that.
Yeah.
So the answer is yes, of course. So
it is a Christmas movie. Well, it'll be interesting to see. That may be a question that I ask a number of guests as we head into the Christmas season. I know that is hotly contested. and
I
wildly
want
debated.
like a graph. Like I want to know who says no because
That's
I'm
right.
crossing them off my Christmas card list. So
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting. We'll see how that unfolds. Maybe we'll throw that up on Twitter to get
I
people's
think that's worth
responses
it.
for
You
the.
think you should
That's
for
right.
sure.
That's right. The important questions, right? Okay, so one final question, Bill, as we wrap up today. And again, I can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your busy day for this. One theme that I'm trying to run through the podcast is the theme of success and happiness, and thinking about I've asked this question of everyone I've interviewed, and it is this: if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what is your definition of success, or how would you define success, how would you answer that person?
I think I would say that my definition of success is knowing with no doubt, with ultimate certainty, that I've made a positive impact on the people around me. And in my case, as a classroom teacher, like that means knowing without a doubt that I've made a positive impact on the kids who go through my room. And it happened for me. I'll just put this up on your screen. For you podcast people, I got a letter in the mail yesterday, and it didn't have any name on the front of it. So I had no idea who it was from, and it's written this beautiful cursive script. And I don't know a single person who writes in cursive, let alone who sends me letters.
Right.
And I opened it up, and it's a letter from a student that I had last year. And I mean, it's just beautiful. You know, it's Miss Ferriter, I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're safe. And it was so good to be in your class. And let me tell you more about, what's happening with me. And so that's success, right? I obviously made enough of a difference on her that she's still thinking about me today. And so success means making a positive impact on the people who are around us. And as teachers, I mean, I think that means making a positive difference on our kids, preparing them academically to be successful, but preparing them socially to be successful, giving them the confidence that they can succeed. Like that's what success is. Facilitating success in others. How about that?
Yeah. No, and Bill, by that definition, it is obvious that you have been wildly successful in having a positive impact on everyone you come into contact with, whether it's
I appreciate
students, whether it's through your family, whether it's at workshops and presentations. The positive impact is ubiquitous, and everybody knows the type of energy and passion that you bring to the job. Bill, I can't thank you enough. Oh, you're welcome. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to be with me today. Listeners, I really would encourage you to follow Bill on Twitter. His Twitter handle is @plugusin. And that's the Twitter handle to follow. And that's where you get a lot of great information from Bill, and sort of almost live updates on how things are unfolding with his practice. And I love it. I would also encourage you to check out his website. That's www.williamferriter.com. And through that website, you can access his wildly popular blog, The Tempered Radical. Lots of great information there, and some wonderful thoughts that Bill's never shy about sharing his thoughts on things, and I think you'll always learn something from the blog posts that Bill posts there. So a lot of the information Bill talked about today is posted in several of the blog posts on that website. So please encourage you to check it out. And for listeners also, Bill had mentioned he's holding up the letter just as a reminder. These interviews, a few weeks after they appear on the podcast, also appear on the YouTube channel. So, and the video version of this will appear on the YouTube channel. So if you haven't subscribed to that YouTube channel yet, I would encourage you to do so. Again, Bill, thanks for carving out time for me today. I'm sure our listeners really appreciated your insight, your passion, and everything that you bring to the job. I've really appreciated it.
Well, I sure appreciate it too, Tom. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, Bill. Take care. Have a great night.
Bye now.